This is part one of a two-part recording in which I'm going to create a multi-container Docker application which consists of PHP 7.4, MySQL 8, an Nginx web server and Node. And then once that's up and running, I'm going to use Composer to install Symfony, and I'll demonstrate how all the containers interact with each other in a realistic Symfony project. If you're going to follow along, the only software you will need to have installed on your host machine is Docker, so you can go to the address on the screen and download Docker Desktop, and like I say, that is literally the only software you'll need to have installed, which is one of the reasons I love Docker. It makes life just so simple. I will say that I'm also going to use Git, which I have installed on my host machine. However, this is entirely optional, and it's just part of my workflow whenever I start a new project, and everything will work the same for you whether or not you follow that step. So first things first, let's figure out what our first step should be. So we're going to need to define our application in a way where all the containers are able to communicate with each other, and to do that we create a Docker Compose YAML file. So Docker Compose is a tool which comes with Docker Desktop, so you should have that installed. And in here, this is basically where we sketch out our application and all of its dependencies. So at the top, we start off by giving it a version, and version 3 is current. Then we had a networks tab, but I'm not going to fill that in just yet. We'll come back to that. First, I'm going to add the services. So the services is just another word for our containers. It's what Docker Compose refers to our containers as when they form part of a network. So we'll just sketch this out to begin with. Nginx, PHP, MySQL, and Node. And so we're going to give each of these a name now. Now what I like to do is make a subtle distinction between referring to each of these as a service and each of these as a container. I'll not go into great detail on that at the moment, but when we get further into this it will become more clear why I do that. So we've got Nginx service, PHP 7.4 service, MySQL service, and these names here are actually host names for our containers, and it's through these names that the containers are able to discover and communicate with each other. So that's our container placeholders. Now let's go back to the networks key at the top and add our own custom network, which I'm just going to name after the services that it's composed of. So Nginx, PHP 7.4, MySQL 8 and Node. And I'll also point out that you don't actually have to create your own network. Docker will add the containers to the default network if none is specified. This is just for demo purposes. So there's our application defined. Let's now go more granular and start to work on our individual services. And we'll start with image. So image is a blueprint for building our container. So what we're saying here is we want an Nginx image, and on the right hand side of this colon is the version. So it's image : version. So what's a stable Alpine business? Well, what that means is Alpine means in Docker speak means minimalist and lightweight, and so we're looking for a latest stable minimalist lightweight version of an Nginx image. So next we'll add container name. So sticking with our theme of making that distinction between calling these services and calling them containers, we shall call this Nginx container, and you'll see the significance of this more probably in part 2 when we start demonstrating communication between the containers. And so next, networks. So we're just going to add this to our custom network which we created. You'll have seen a bit of auto-completion there. I'm using PHP Storm with the Docker plugin, which I highly recommend if you're new to all this stuff, it'll help you out quite a lot. And then we're going to add ports. So ports, what they are is a mapping between ports on your host machine and ports on your container. So in this example, we're going to go for port 8080 on our host machine. So it is double quote 8080 colon 80, which is the port on the container. And so next we're going to do volumes. So straight from the documentation, volumes are the preferred mechanism for persisting data generated by and used by Docker containers. So what we're doing here is we're creating a reference from a folder called app on our host machine to a folder at this location, var/www/project on the container. So the main benefit of this to me and you is that even if the container is completely erased, any data which has been generated at this location will be preserved on our host machine in the app folder. That's pretty cool. Next up, we need to add a config file for our web server. So I'm at the Nginx page on Docker Hub, and I'm going to do a search for a file called default.conf. And so if we look down here where it says outputs to, this is the location of the config file on our container. So let's copy that address and we'll go back to our Docker compose file, and then we're just going to create another volume reference, and this time it's going to be a default conf file in an Nginx folder. And here's the reference. And so now that we've got those two in place, let's go and create those folders while we remember. So we're going to need an app folder and an Nginx folder. App and Nginx. And so just before we do our config, there's one other thing, our dependencies. So what this means is, by adding these dependencies, is that PHP and MySQL will start up before Nginx. With that step complete, now let's add this default conf file. So we're going to create a reference between our default conf file, which is in this Nginx location, and the default conf on the container. So go to our Nginx folder, and we're just adding default conf. So I'll level with you, I'm no server administration expert, so where will we find the contents for this file? Let's see what the Symfony docs have. And if you go to this address on the screen, at the top of the screen now, that will take you directly to the gold. What we have here is a minimum config to get a Symfony application up and running. So I'll copy that and paste it into ours, and then we'll just need to make a few customizations, and that should then be good to go. So if we look at our root here, if you remember our Docker compose file, we had a volume which we were referencing from a local folder called app. So var www project, that is actually where our project files are going to live for a Symfony application. So let's add a couple more keys here and make this our own. In index, and remember we were listening on port 80 and mapping that to port 8080 on our local machine. Server name localhost, keep it simple. And in fact, I've got the index wrong there. The index shouldn't be localhost, index should be index PHP for modern Symfony application. And we're just going to take these logs from the bottom, keep everything together at the top. So we'll cut those and paste those in here. Okay. And there's one other change we need to make. So this key here, fast CGI underscore pass, this is what we're actually going to use for the location of our PHP. And if you recall what I said about using the service names as the container host names, well, this is the first time we're going to do that. So we'll paste that in there, and then PHP is going to be listening on port 9000. And there's one more thing I'm going to do, which is a fix for an issue I had with Symfony errors. The headers were coming back too large to actually display them. I was getting a bad gateway error. So this bumps up the buffer sizes, and that should make everything work. If you want to read more about the technical ins and outs, I'll leave the link in the file. And I've just realised we've got one more fix to do. This bit shouldn't say port 80, it should say listen 80. And that concludes things for our default conf. So pretty straightforward. Let's now move on and start working on our PHP container, which we're going to build using a Docker file instead of a pre-designed image from Docker Hub. So instead of the image key, we need a build key. And then underneath that, context, which should actually be the location of your Docker file, but you can do it this way instead. Docker file, and then we're going to put this in a PHP folder, and we'll call it Docker file. You can call it something else. For example, if you had other Docker files at that location, you want to give it a different name. Container name, again, we're going to make that distinction between services and containers, and we will call this PHP 7.4 container. And then we need to add networks, so exactly the same as our Nginx container. We only have one custom network which we'll attach this to, and again you'll see our auto completion there. What next? Okay, ports. So if you remember our default conf file that we just worked on, we said PHP will be listening on port 9000. So on the left hand side of the colon we have 9000, that's our host machine, then colon, and then 9000, which is the ports on the container, and volumes. So again, our project files will live in var www project, and we'll create that reference from this app folder. And that's everything we need in order to define the container. Now we need to work out how to build it, which we will do using a Docker file. So it's simply called Docker file, no extension. So we're going to start off with a from key. So it's from PHP 7.4 hyphen FPM. I'm using this FPM version because we're using Nginx, and FPM stands for Fast CGI Process Manager. You can read more about that hipster stuff on Google should you wish. Next, we're going to paste in a load of extensions. So I've not just made this stuff up as I'm going along. These are actually extensions which you'll need to run a Symfony 5 application. So that's the command for installing PHP extensions, and the usual suspects really: PDO, MySQL. Next, we have a key called workdir, and this will be the working directory for all subsequent commands, and you'll see more example uses of this as we move further into the project. And next up we will add composer. So forgive me again for pasting this stuff in. This is your typical composer install, and what it does, it gives us binary so that we can run composer commands globally inside our container. And then we're going to add one more tool, which is the Symphony Installer, and we'll use that mainly to check we've got all the correct PHP extensions to run a Symfony project. And the bottom line is just it moves the binary so that again we can run this Symfony command globally inside our container. And that finishes off our Docker file. So 15 lines, that's all we need. Let's now move on and start to work on our MySQL container. So we'll start off the same way as we did with our Nginx container. So we're going to need image, which we'll get from the Docker Hub. So the format is image name : version, so MySQL : 8, and then we'll give this a container name, and we'll stick to our established pattern. So this will be MySQL 8-container, and then we shall add it to our custom network. And for our next part after this, we're going to go over to the MySQL page on Docker Hub, and we're just going to grab some configuration here. So if you scroll down a bit of the way down the MySQL page, you'll see a Docker Compose example, and we're just going to grab these keys here: command, restart, and environment. So grab those, copy, move back over and paste those in here. Okay, so command, default authentication. You will definitely need this if you're using MySQL and MySQL 8. You won't be able to authenticate without this, and I'm going to paste in a couple more, which is our character set and our collation. Otherwise we'll get Latin Swedish just for extra randomness. Environment, this is where you can set environment variables on the container, and we're going to need a MySQL password and a MySQL user. So we'll just go with root for the user, and I'll just stick with secret for the password. And then what else do we need? We need ports and volume. So we'll drop these in underneath the container name. Ports. Now typically I'd use 3306:3306. However, I've got MySQL, or shall I say I've got MariaDB already installed on my host machine. So instead of using 3306, I'm just going to change the first digit and use 4306. And then volumes, we're going to need to go back to the MySQL documentation on Docker Hub, because there is a particularity with this. So if we look here, it's saying create a data directory on a suitable volume on your host system, and it gives you a suggested name, and then it gives you a directory on the host system where that will be mounted to. So we're going to copy that part, and we're not going to use the suggested folder name from the documentation. We're just going to stick to our pattern and call this MySQL, and then that mounts to var lib MySQL on the container. Restart, so I'm pretty sure this means always restart unless stopped. If not, it means something very similar. So we're going to stick with that default from the Docker Hub documentation for MySQL, and that's MySQL complete. Let's now move on to the final piece of the puzzle, which is node, and we'll start off with an image again. So we're going to say node : latest. So you don't have to specify a number, you can just put latest and it will grab you the latest version. That's very common. Container name, we'll call this node container, and then what we need to do is add this to our custom network like all of the others. Then we're going to move back to our Docker file, and if you recall, when we added our working directory, well, we're going to do a very similar thing here. So this means the same thing in a Docker Compose file. It's working_dir, and so it will be the same. We're referencing the same location as in our Docker file, and that is actually where our node modules folder will live. And then we need to do volumes, and so again this is going to be our mounting from the app folder on the local host into var www/project, which is our project folder on the container. So with all that in place, that completes our node container. Very straightforward there. Let's see if there's anything outstanding before we spin this up and get it all working. And I can see straight away we don't actually have our MySQL folder, so we shall add that first. And then once we've got that step out of the way, we need to figure out how we're going to serve this. So we established that our project folder, where all our project files, is going to be var.project. If we go back to our default conf file, you'll see there's a public folder inside of the project folder, and our index file is just going to be called index.php. So it looks like we just need to add a public folder, and inside of that we will use an index.php file as our front controller. So we're going to create it inside of app, public, and then we add an index.php file. And all we need to do, we just want to prove that it's working, so we'll echo out hello world. And then once that step's taken care of, we shall go back to our terminal and we need to compose our application. So we are in the same location as our Docker compose file, which for us is the root of our project, and the command is docker compose up-d, which means it will hand the terminal back to you once finished. And we're adding a build flag which says build anything which needs to be built, which in our case is our PHP container. And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit to completion, and then all we need to do is go to our browser to test that this works. So we're going to enter localhost :8080, and there you have it. Perfect. So hopefully you've managed to follow along and that's working for you also. If you'd like to see more content like this, then go ahead and hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have any questions or feedback, then please post those in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you, and I do read them all. Coming up in part 2, we will start to pimp our app by adding Composer, Symfony, some node modules and various other cool bits and pieces. It's going to be awesome, you're going to love it, and it will definitely be shorter than this one, I promise you. I'll see you there.